She was just 9 years old, her pink sneakers scuffing the sidewalk as she bounced her basketball in front of our own house. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, until the neighbor stepped out. His glare was sharp, his voice sharper. "What are you doing here? You don't belong here," he barked, as if a child playing on her own driveway was a crime. Before she could even answer, he had his phone out, calling the cops like she was some threat to the neighborhood. 8 minutes later, he'd regret every word, every assumption. Because when her father arrived, the game changed, and the neighbor's world came crashing down. Before I take you through what happened in those 8 minutes, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments, and make sure to subscribe if you believe no child should have to face this kind of hate. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind that painted the sky gold and filled the streets with the hum of weekend life. 12-year-old Amara Thompson stood at the edge of her family's driveway, her pink basketball bouncing rhythmically against the pavement. She had a big game the following week at school and had promised her dad she'd practice her dribbling until her wrists ached. Her braids swung behind her as she focused, counting her bounces out loud, her laughter mingling with the sound of the ball. Across the street, a white sedan sat parked in front of a freshly trimmed lawn. Beside it, standing like a sentry, was their neighbor, Gerald Simmons. Gerald had lived in the neighborhood for 10 years, but even after the Thompsons moved in 6 months ago, he'd never bothered to learn their names. He always kept a watchful, almost suspicious eye on their home, as if their presence somehow didn't fit the image he had of his perfect neighborhood. When Gerald saw Amara, his face tightened. She was wearing a bright yellow jersey with Thompson stitched across the back, but all he saw was someone he thought didn't belong. He strode toward her, his voice raised before he was even close enough for a civil word. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he barked. Amara paused mid-dribble, startled by the harsh tone. "Just practicing," she said softly, pointing to her house, the front door only a few feet behind her. Gerald narrowed his eyes. "Practicing? For what? I don't think you live here. This isn't a playground. Whose property are you on?" Amara's heart skipped. "I do live here," she murmured, glancing nervously at the front window, wishing her dad were home already. But Gerald wasn't listening. He yanked out his phone with a sigh that was both performative and venomous. "You know what? I'm calling the cops. Let's see how you explain yourself to them." Amara froze. Her basketball rolled into the gutter. Forgotten. She'd seen enough news stories to know what could happen when police were called on someone who looked like her. She swallowed hard, tears prickling her eyes. "You can't call the cops. I live here," she said, her voice trembling. Gerald smirked. "Sure you do. You people are always saying that. I've never seen you before." His words cut through her like glass. "You people?" 2 words that told her exactly why he didn't believe her. She looked around, desperate, but the street was empty. For a moment, her mind flashed to the lessons her father, Derek Thompson, had drilled into her. If someone treats you like you don't belong, stand tall. Never let them see your fear. But she was 12, alone, and the fear felt bigger than she was. Gerald had already dialed. "Yes, officer," he said loudly, his voice dripping with self-importance. "There's a suspicious individual here on my neighbor's driveway. Might be trespassing." Amara stepped back toward the front door, her hands trembling. 8 minutes. That's how long it would take for her father to get home. 8 minutes would decide whether she walked back into the house safe or scarred by yet another encounter with someone who saw her skin as a threat. But what Gerald didn't know was this. In those same 8 minutes, his smug confidence would crumble. Because her dad wasn't just any father. Derek Thompson wasn't a man you underestimated, not when it came to protecting his daughter. Before I continue, I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly just because of how they look? Drop your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe every child deserves to feel safe in their own neighborhood. Amara's hands were shaking as she grabbed her basketball and sprinted toward the front porch. Her chest tightened with fear, her young mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. She had never been in trouble before, but the way Gerald's voice carried through the air made her feel like a criminal. From the corner of her eye, she saw Gerald pacing, his phone still glued to his ear. Yes. I said there's a girl here. She looks suspicious. She's loitering, bouncing a ball like she's casing the house. Those words stung. Casing the house? This was her home. The porch swing, the bright red door, the flowers her dad planted. Everything here was hers. Yet here was this man, a neighbor, treating her as if she had no right to exist on her own property. Tears burned her eyes, but she swallowed them back. Her dad always told her, Amara, never cry in front of someone who wants to see you small. So she held her chin high, even as her voice trembled when she pulled out her phone to call him. Daddy, she whispered when he picked up. He's calling the police on me. There was a brief silence on the line, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Then her father's voice came, calm but sharp. Who? What happened? Mr. Simmons, she said, her voice cracking. He said, I don't live here. He's telling the police I'm suspicious. Daddy, I didn't do anything. Listen to me, baby, Derek said, his voice dropping to that steady, protective tone that always made her feel safe. Go inside. Lock the door. I'll be there in 5 minutes. But the police. I'll handle the police, he said firmly. Do not step outside again until I get there. Do you hear me? Yes, Daddy, she whispered, her throat tight. Meanwhile, Gerald continued his self-righteous tirade on the sidewalk. Yes, officer. I live across the street. I'm telling you, I don't think this girl belongs here. I've never seen her before. She's acting suspicious. Can you send someone right away? It didn't matter to him that Amara's bike was parked by the porch, or that her name was written in chalk on the driveway from the last game she played. All he saw was her brown skin, her braided hair, and her presence in a neighborhood he thought he owned. Inside the house, Amara paced the living room, glancing out the window every few seconds. Her stomach churned as she imagined flashing lights, sirens, and police officers asking her questions she didn't know how to answer. She tried to steady her breathing, just like her father had taught her. Derek's car roared down the highway, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles were white. He had faced prejudice before, at work, at restaurants, even while walking through stores, but hearing the fear in his daughter's voice lit a fire he hadn't felt in years. 8 minutes, he thought. That was all he needed to turn this entire situation upside down. Back in the neighborhood, Gerald stood smugly by the curb, glancing toward Amara's house as though he had done some heroic deed. He didn't notice the curtains shift, Amara's small face peeking out from behind them. He didn't see the hurt and confusion in her eyes, but he would. Derek's SUV screeched to a halt in front of the Thompson house, the sound of rubber against asphalt slicing through the tense silence of the street. He barely turned the ignition off before jumping out, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the sinking afternoon sun. Every step he took radiated the kind of controlled anger that came from being pushed too far, too many times. Amara flung the front door open the moment she saw him, her eyes glistening with relief. "Daddy!" she cried, rushing into his arms. He scooped her up, holding her tightly as if to shield her from the world. "You okay, baby?" he asked, his voice steady but his jaw clenched tight. She nodded against his chest, though her trembling hands told a different story. "He said I don't live here. He called the cops." Derek's eyes darkened as he turned his gaze to Gerald, who stood at the edge of the driveway with his phone still in hand. The man had the audacity to look annoyed, as if Derek's arrival was an inconvenience. "Mr. Simmons?" Derek said, his voice low but laced with authority. "You mind telling me why you're harassing my daughter on our own property?" Gerald squared his shoulders, though his confidence wavered slightly under Derek's sharp stare. "I was just looking out for the neighborhood," he said defensively. "I didn't recognize her. Kids don't just show up around here. I was trying to make sure nothing suspicious was going on." "Suspicious?" Derek's tone hardened. "She was bouncing a basketball in front of her own home. What's suspicious about that? Or is it just suspicious because of the color of her skin?" Gerald opened his mouth, but no words came out. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you have any idea," Derek continued, stepping closer, "what could happen when you call the police on a black child? Do you understand the kind of fear you just put in her head? She's 12 years old, Gerald. 12. Gerald shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting away. "Look, I didn't mean..." "Don't you dare say you didn't mean it," Derek cut him off, his voice dropping an octave. Because I've seen men like you not mean it all my life. You knew exactly what you were doing. You didn't see a little girl. You saw a problem. You saw someone you think doesn't belong here, even though her name's on the mailbox, even though her father pays the same property taxes you do. Amara clung to her father's hand, watching him with wide eyes. She had never seen him this angry, but there was something in his tone that made her feel safe too. Like nothing in the world could touch her as long as he was here. Gerald swallowed, his arrogance shrinking with every word Derek spoke. But before he could muster a reply, the faint sound of police sirens echoed down the street. Derek turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. Good. Let's settle this right now, he said, his voice icy. You called them? We'll all wait together. Gerald's smugness faltered. For the first time, he looked nervous. The wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the tense evening air. Amara squeezed Derek's hand as 2 squad cars turned the corner and rolled slowly up the street, their lights flashing blue and red across the neat row of houses. Gerald straightened his posture, almost smug again, as if the arrival of the officers would somehow validate his false accusations. Stay here, baby, Derek murmured to Amara. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that came from years of navigating situations where even the slightest misstep could spiral out of control. The first officer, a tall white man with a stiff jaw, stepped out of his car. He looked at Gerald first. Sir, you made the call? Yes, officer, Gerald said quickly, pointing toward Amara. That girl, she was loitering in front of this house. I don't think she lives here, and that's my daughter, Derek cut in sharply, stepping forward with his shoulders squared. This is our house. You were never invited onto my property, and you had no right to harass her. The officer's eyes flicked between Gerald and Derek, his expression neutral but guarded. Sir, he said to Derek, we got a report of suspicious activity. We're just here to make sure everything's okay. Derek's jaw tightened. He'd heard those exact words before, just here to make sure everything's okay, but it always seemed to translate into, prove you belong here. Everything was fine until he started threatening a 12-year-old child, Derek replied, his voice steady but sharp. She was playing basketball on her own driveway, and instead of minding his business, he decided to call you because he doesn't think a black kid belongs in this neighborhood. Gerald frowned. Whoa, let's not make this about race. Then what is it about? Derek demanded, turning to face him fully. She was on her own property, wearing her school jersey, holding her own ball. What about that screams criminal? What about that warrants you calling the police? The second officer, a younger black woman, stepped out of the second car. Her eyes swept the scene, taking in the tension, the child clutching her father's hand, the neighbor who was suddenly looking less confident than before. Sir, she said to Gerald, her voice measured. Did you confirm whether she actually lives here before you made the call? Gerald hesitated, then muttered, I didn't think I had to. I've never seen her outside before. Because she's in school during the day, Derek shot back. Because she has better things to do than stand around on your lawn. But you saw her skin, and that was enough for you, wasn't it? The younger officer's gaze hardened as she looked at Gerald. We don't take false reports lightly. If you made a call because of an assumption, that's a problem. Gerald's face paled slightly. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. From what? A little girl? Derek's voice rose, though he still controlled his tone. You terrified her, you made her call me crying, and now you want to play the hero? No, not today. The female officer turned to Derek. Sir, do you want to file a harassment report? Derek looked at Amara, then back at Gerald, whose smugness had dissolved into nervous silence. Not yet, he said quietly, but trust me, this conversation isn't over. The first officer shifted awkwardly, as though realizing how wrong the call had been. The younger officer gave Gerald a sharp look. You should apologize, she said. Gerald's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He wasn't ready to face the reality of what he'd done, or what was coming. A small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the flashing police lights and the tension hanging in the air. Doors cracked open, and curious faces peeked out from porches and windows. The scene had shifted from a simple misunderstanding to a spectacle, one that Gerald was clearly losing control over. Derek stood tall in the driveway, his arm protectively around Amara's shoulders. "Gerald," he said, his eyes locked on the man, "you've lived across from us for 6 months. 6 months, and you've never once introduced yourself. You never waved when you saw my daughter playing outside. But today, you thought you had the right to call the cops on her. Why? Tell everyone here why." Gerald shifted, his face turning a blotchy red. "I told you, I didn't recognize her. I didn't want any trouble." "You didn't recognize her?" Derek repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "She lives here. She's been living here since the day we moved in. Do you have any idea what it means for a 12-year-old black girl to have cops called on her? Did you even think about that before you picked up your phone?" The younger officer, the black woman, crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on Gerald. "You made an assumption based on nothing but appearances?" "No," she said flatly. "This is exactly the kind of call we're trying to prevent, false alarms rooted in bias." The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. A woman across the street frowned and whispered to her husband, "Isn't that the Thompson girl? She's the sweetest kid. I saw her helping her mom with groceries last week." Gerald's jaw tightened. "I wasn't being racist. I was just being cautious. You people always jump to..." "Stop, right there." Derek's voice cut through like steel. "Did you just say you people again? That's exactly the problem, Gerald. You don't see Amara as a kid who's part of this neighborhood. You see her as an outsider, as someone who doesn't belong. And the only reason you see that is because of the color of her skin." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the officers stood still, their eyes on Gerald as his mouth opened and closed, searching for a response that wouldn't make him look worse. "Say it," Derek challenged, his voice low but commanding. "Say to her face that you thought she was suspicious. Say it to a 12-year-old girl who was just trying to play ball on her own driveway." Amara's big brown eyes met Gerald's. Her small voice broke the tension like a glass shattering on the pavement. "Why don't you like me? I never did anything to you." Gerald froze. He looked at the little girl, her voice trembling but brave, and for a moment his posture deflated. His lips parted, but the words caught in his throat. The younger officer stepped forward. "I think you owe this family an apology." Gerald swallowed hard, his pride battling with the eyes of the neighborhood watching. I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Louder," Derek said, his voice quiet but firm. "So my daughter hears it." "I'm sorry," Gerald said again, this time louder, his eyes dropping to the ground. Derek didn't smile, didn't nod. He just looked at him and said, 8 minutes, Gerald. That's how long it took for your bad decision to expose who you really are." The silence lingered for a moment after Gerald's forced apology. But Derek wasn't about to let it end there. Not when his daughter had been humiliated and frightened on her own property. He turned to the growing circle of neighbors who had gathered, some pretending they were just out for a walk, others openly watching from their lawns. "Let's talk about what just happened here," Derek said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Because this isn't just about my daughter or one man's bad decision. This is about a mindset. One that tells a grown man it's okay to call the police on a child just because of the color of her skin." The younger officer nodded slightly, acknowledging his point. The older officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the weight of Derek's words. "She's 12, Derek continued, his arm resting protectively on Amara's shoulder. "She should be able to dribble a basketball in her own driveway without worrying that someone will look at her and see a threat. But here we are, with flashing lights and uniforms, because someone couldn't look past his own prejudice for even a second." A few of the neighbors lowered their eyes. Some looked guilty, others thoughtful. Derek wasn't just speaking to Gerald now, he was speaking to all of them. "This isn't the first time I've seen this," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I've had store managers follow me through aisles for no reason. I've had people clutch their purses when I walked by. And now my daughter, my little girl, gets to learn what that feels like, all because a neighbor didn't think she belonged here. Well, let me make something clear. She belongs. We belong. And we're not going anywhere." Amara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and lingering fear. Derek's voice softened as he knelt slightly to her level. "You didn't do anything wrong, baby. You hear me? You don't ever let someone make you feel like you don't belong in your own home." She nodded, her lips pressed together as she fought back tears. Turning back to Gerald, Derek's expression hardened again. "You could have walked over and asked who she was. You could have introduced yourself, but instead, you decided to treat her like a suspect. Do you have any idea how dangerous that could have been if these officers showed up with the wrong assumptions?" Gerald's face was pale, his shoulders slumped. I wasn't thinking." "You were thinking," Derek shot back. "You just weren't thinking beyond your bias." The younger officer spoke up, her tone respectful. "Mr. Thompson, you're absolutely right. This is exactly why we're trained to evaluate these kinds of calls carefully. I'll be filing a note on this incident. There's no reason your daughter should have gone through this." Derek gave her a curt nod of appreciation. "Thank you, officer. I just hope the next time someone sees my daughter playing outside, they see her for what she is. A kid. Not a threat, not a stranger, just a kid." 8 minutes. That's all it had taken to turn a proud man into someone who now wished he'd stayed inside his house. "You know what's sad?" Derek began, scanning the small crowd of neighbors. "This isn't even surprising. This is the kind of story you hear about on the news. An innocent black kid, minding their own business, suddenly treated like a criminal because someone didn't recognize them. But I never thought I'd see it right here, in front of my own house, with my own child." The younger officer nodded slightly, her jaw tight, while the older officer's eyes shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Thompson," the older officer finally said, "we didn't come here to escalate anything. We just—" "No," Derek interrupted firmly, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "I know why you're here. But let's not pretend that a call like this doesn't come with danger. One wrong assumption, one wrong move, and this could have gone a very different way. And my daughter? She would have been the one paying for someone else's prejudice." A neighbor across the street, a woman with a kind face, stepped forward slightly. "He's right," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "We've all seen Amara before. She's just a kid. This was unnecessary, Gerald." The younger officer stepped forward, her gaze locking on Gerald. "This is going in the incident report," she said flatly. "If you make another call like this, there could be consequences." Derek took a deep breath, his voice calmer, but no less powerful. 8 minutes ago, you thought you could treat my daughter like she didn't belong. 8 minutes ago, you thought calling the cops would prove your point. But look at you now. Who really doesn't belong here, Gerald? "Let me ask everyone here something," Derek said, his tone firm but measured. "What kind of neighborhood do you want this to be? One where children are safe to play, to laugh, to just be kids? Or one where the sight of a black child with a basketball is enough to summon police cars?" Several neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. A man 2 houses down shifted his weight, clearing his throat but saying nothing. The woman who had spoken earlier stepped closer, nodding softly. "This," Derek continued, "is exactly why conversations about racial profiling are not just some abstract issue you see on TV. It happens here. It happens in front of your houses. It happened to my daughter today. And I won't let this go unnoticed." Amara looked up at him, her face still pale, but her eyes beginning to glimmer with a quiet pride. Her father's words were strong, protective, and unapologetic, exactly what she needed to hear. "You all saw it," Derek said, turning slightly to face Gerald again. "She wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't hurting anyone. But in 8 minutes, her life could have been changed because of one man's fear and ignorance." "I don't want an apology just for me," Derek said, his voice rising slightly. "I want you to look at her, my daughter, and apologize to her. Because she's the one you terrified. She's the one you made feel like she didn't belong in her own home." Gerald's eyes flicked to Amara. For a moment, he hesitated, his pride clearly fighting every word. But with the neighbors watching, the officers standing by, and Derek's unrelenting gaze, he finally said, I'm sorry, Amara. I shouldn't have called the police on you." Amara blinked, her lips pressing together. "You scared me," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Gerald muttered, his voice barely audible. Derek nodded once, but his tone didn't soften. "An apology is a start, but I hope you understand this isn't about being sorry. It's about changing how you think. Next time you see someone who doesn't look like you, maybe you start by asking yourself why you're so quick to judge them." The younger officer gave a small nod of agreement. "He's right. We deal with too many calls like this. Calls that waste our time and put innocent people in danger. This has to stop." 8 minutes ago, Derek said, turning to his daughter, "you were scared. But now? Now you know you're stronger than their ignorance. And I promise you, baby, I'll never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Not while I'm here." Amara hugged him tightly, and for a moment, the weight of the confrontation eased. Derek turned his attention to the officers, his tone firm but respectful. "I want every detail of this incident documented," he said. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, racially biased call on a child, and I want it on record so it doesn't happen again, to my family or to anyone else." The younger officer nodded without hesitation. "You have my word, Mr. Thompson. I'll file a full report. It will include the fact that there was no crime, no suspicious activity, and that your daughter was harassed by a false claim." The older officer, shifting uncomfortably, cleared his throat. "Sir, we don't usually take action on a neighborly dispute unless—" "This wasn't a dispute," Derek cut in, his voice sharp but controlled. "This was an abuse of 911 services, based on nothing but bias. If I called the police every time I saw Gerald mowing his lawn or taking out his trash, we both know I'd be in handcuffs by now. So no, this isn't just a neighborly misunderstanding. I need you to treat it with the seriousness it deserves." The officer paused, realizing there was no argument to be made. "Understood," he finally said. Gerald shifted on his feet, his face flushed with frustration. "Look, I said I was sorry. What more do you want from me?" Derek turned toward him slowly, his expression unwavering. "I don't want anything from you, Gerald. I want you to learn. I want you to understand that calling the cops on a child could have ended in disaster. What if they showed up thinking she was armed? What if they came here ready to assume the worst? Do you even realize how easily that story could have ended in tragedy?" Gerald's eyes darted away, his silence betraying the truth. He hadn't thought about it, not once. Derek looked around at the gathering crowd. "I hope this is the last time we ever have to stand out here like this. I hope this neighborhood can do better than this. My daughter deserves better. Every child does." Amara, still clutching her father's hand, looked up at him with a quiet determination in her eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "are they going to make him stop calling the cops on me?" Derek crouched to her level, his voice softening. "Yes, baby. They'll know better now, and if they don't, I'll make sure they do." The younger officer stepped closer. "Mr. Thompson, I'll also file a note to dispatch about this address. If another call like this comes from him without valid cause, there will be consequences. That's the least we can do." "Thank you," Derek said, his tone genuine. Gerald stood on the curb, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact with anyone. For all his earlier bravado, he now looked like a man who wished he could disappear into the ground. Derek crouched beside Amara, brushing a loose braid from her face. "You okay, princess?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her voice trembled. "I was scared, Daddy, when he said he was calling the cops. I thought I did something wrong." "You didn't do anything wrong," Derek said firmly, his voice carrying for everyone left to hear. "You were playing on your own driveway. You were being a kid. The only person who was wrong here is standing over there." Gerald flinched but said nothing. Derek stood, his presence commanding yet calm. "Let me say this so there's no misunderstanding," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "My daughter, and every child, has the right to feel safe in their own home. We shouldn't have to fear that a neighbor's ignorance could turn a normal day into a nightmare." The younger officer, still taking notes, looked up. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you know you did everything right. We see too many cases where things go wrong fast because of these calls. You handled this with strength and grace." Derek gave her a small nod. "Thank you, but I don't want to have to handle this again. Not for my daughter, not for anyone else's child." "Gerald, you've got kids of your own, don't you?" Gerald hesitated, then muttered, "Yeah." "How would you feel if someone called the cops on them just for playing outside?" Derek asked. Gerald's lips tightened. He didn't answer. "That's what I thought," Derek said coldly. "Next time, think before you act. Not everyone gets 8 minutes for their father to show up and fix things." Amara looked up at him, her small hand sliding into his. "Daddy," she whispered. "Can we go inside now?" "Yeah, baby," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. "We're going inside. This is over." He turned to the officers. "Thank you for coming. I'll follow up about that report." The younger officer nodded. "We'll make sure this is handled correctly." As Derek walked his daughter inside, he paused at the door and looked back. 8 minutes, he said, his voice firm but steady. That's all it took for Gerald to make a decision he'll regret for a long time. And I hope everyone here remembers this. Silence in the face of prejudice is just as bad as the prejudice itself. We can all do better. Inside, Amara sat on the couch, hugging her basketball. Derek sat next to her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You know something?" he said softly. "You're stronger than you think. Today was ugly, but you didn't let it break you." She looked up at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I wasn't strong until you got here." "You were always strong," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Before you go, tell me, have you ever seen or experienced something like this?" Share your story in the comments, and if you believe no child should face hate for simply being themselves, subscribe and join our community of voices that refuse to stay silent. The end.